What's up there, people? It's Matt from Producer School. Hope y'all are doing well today. I'm going to give it just another second here, let a couple more people join. Hey, make sure I just put in the comments, if you're just joining, that you join the Music Producer School community. I'm going to be going there right now. We just did our first one this past Saturday. And after the live stream class on Saturday, I went over just to the Music Producer School community page, and I listened to a couple tracks there of you guys, and it was a lot of fun. We had a couple good tracks that we listened to. I gave a little feedback, a couple tips on some things that could be done to take them to the next level, and I think it was beneficial for everybody. So make sure you join that if you haven't already. That's the Music Producer School community. I just put the link in the Facebook comments. And I'm not able to always see. Be sure to leave me a comment if you're watching right now. I'm not always able to see on the program that I'm streaming with your username, depending on your settings. So I see somebody left me a comment about saying nice instrument. I'm not sure. Are you talking about the instrumental in the beginning? Because somebody last class asked me about the track that plays at the beginning of the live streams. And that's actually a track that I made that I just use for the introduction for Music Producer School. Let's see here. Francis, sorry, my studio is not open to. I don't do outside projects anymore. Not right now, anyway. I've used to own a bunch of different studios, and I've worked in a bunch of different studios, and I don't do public work anymore. But I appreciate you asking, and hopefully one of these days I'll be able to do some live studio demonstration stuff for you guys, meaning you could come in and we could work together. But thanks for the comment, Francis. Hope everybody's doing well. So let's go ahead and get into it today. What I wanted to talk about today was mixing, and what I was going to do today was just kind of lay out kind of how I approach mixing, and then the next couple of classes I'm going to kind of break those down a little bit further and do a little more detail into each of those. I happen to be a pretty big organizational person, so I cannot stress enough, especially if you want to work in a what I would call a commercial studio, meaning you're going to have paying clients come in to work with you, and that's whether you want to be a producer or just an engineer. But I find a lot of people don't understand that a big part of producing is not just making beats or making tracks. A big part of producing, when you're a producer, it's your job to make the whole project come together, and it has to be a coherent finished thing, and that could mean the artwork, the distribution to the online streaming services. If you're the producer, you're basically the one that's got to get shit done. That's pretty much how it works, because we all know artists are not the best at getting anything done. So it's up to you as the producer. Maybe you did make the beat. Maybe you mixed it yourself, or maybe if you're, especially when you get to the higher levels, it's a little more uncommon to produce a track and to mix it yourself, but it's definitely not something that nobody does. I mean, I've produced and mixed a bunch of my own things and mastered my own stuff. It really just depends on what the budget for the project is. Some projects I may have spent maybe 6 months working on it, and at the end of it, like I said in the last class, you get so close to these songs and so fixated on stuff, it's kind of hard to take a step back and really, listen objectively to what you've been doing. So what I wanted to do today is I wanted to talk and, like I said, kind of lay out for you guys the basic few things that I always think about whenever I'm mixing a song. And it doesn't matter what kind of song it is. It could be country music, rap music, EDM, anything. So I wanted to kind of go over those things today and just lay them out for you so you could start thinking about them. And also, if any of you guys or girls have any specific questions about mixing, which is what we're covering this week, feel free to drop me a comment. And also, do me a favor, make sure y'all hit the share button on the stream so that we can get it out to as many people as possible. And if you're just joining, again, I put the music producer community link in the comments on Facebook. So be sure to join that. That's where on Saturday I'm gonna go over there and I'm gonna let you guys submit your tracks for me to listen to, and I'm gonna try and help you out the best I can with that. So let's get into mixing, and we'll just kind of cover the main stuff today, and then we'll get a little more into it in the next class. So mixing. There we go. So for mixing, there's a few fundamental things that I do for every single mix. And what I wanted to try and do is cover them in a bit of an order that I kind of think mentally the way that I approach them. So when it comes to mixing, the first thing that I think is one of the most important things, and I'll kind of just number these, is I'm going to call it just organization. So what this means is especially naming your tracks, and then I also like to color code. And I'll just kind of talk on this subject a little bit. So I've gotten a ton of mixes that somebody hired me to mix, or even if I kind of took over as a producer on a track, and I would open up the session, and inevitably there's like 50 tracks, and they're all named Audio 1, Audio 2, Audio 3, Audio 4, and it's just really not helpful when you're trying, because a lot of people, they don't understand this main thing, and this is a good little tip I'm gonna give all you guys right now. Whenever you're mixing or whenever you're working on music, you always want to try to work, in my opinion, as fast as possible. Now that doesn't mean you want to be sloppy, and it doesn't mean you want to just kind of like, oh, whatever, that's fine, let's whatever. But you want to work quickly because your ears can only listen to stuff for so long before they start getting tired and before you start kind of not really hearing what's actually going on. So after about an hour or so of just listening, and everybody, we all know I'm guilty. We love to jack it up, crank up the volume in the studio and get to vibing and listening to your track, and it sounds all cool on the big speakers. And yeah, that's cool. But when you listen like that for 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour, your ears physically will start to get tired and you're not hearing everything that's going on. So I always try to work as fast as possible. And again, if you start working in a commercial studio where you have paying clients, of course, they're paying by the hour, so they want you to work as quickly as possible also. So when it comes to organization, a lot of people, they think, oh, well, why would I take, 30 minutes just to go and label all my tracks and color code my tracks? I could be working on the track itself. But the thing is this, especially when you get to the end, and we're talking about mixing this week, if your stuff is not organized, you're going to waste way more time than 30 minutes just trying to find that kick drum, or just trying. The worst is when you keep hearing this little sound in the track and you can't even find it in the tracks because you keep looking and you're soloing and you're muting and you're like, where is this sound coming from? So it's, in my opinion, the first thing you should do when you say, okay, I'm done, producing or making the beat or doing, we're done working on the track itself as far as the creative part goes, the arrangement's done, and now we're going to mix. And that's also kind of a mental decision that I think a lot of people don't really make. there's no hard rule saying you can't go back and maybe add a synth or add a drum or whatever it may be, but you have to kind of mentally say, okay, I'm done making this beat or I'm done making this track. So that way you can focus on, okay, let's make this track sound the best it possibly can. So I can't recommend enough. Take the time when you're getting into a mix to organize your tracks, name the tracks, and color code the tracks. And when I say organize, I also mean what I like to do. Let me, I have an example here in FL that I wanted to show you. So in FL Studio, if I'm working in the arrangement up here, I'm going to color code, and I do the same color codes for every single song that I work on. It's just my own personal color coding system, and I would highly recommend that you get your own color coding system going as well. And the way mine works is I always do my drums in yellow. I always do my vocals in like a bright pink or a red. I always do my bass in blue. And then I always do my synthesizers and my guitars in a green. And the reason I do synthesizers and guitars in the same color code category is because synthesizers and guitars most of the time they kind of take up the same frequency range. So again, I'm grouping all my drums with yellow. I'm grouping my vocals with a bright either pink or red because I want those to stand out because the vocals are always the most important. The blue for bass, B and B just kind of goes together well. And then if I do have other instruments, you know, I'll color code them accordingly if it's kind of like auxiliary or miscellaneous stuff. But again, come up with your own color coding system and use it on every track that you do. So in other words, I could pull up a track that I worked on 5 years ago, and I don't even have to look at the names of the tracks. I could just tell by the colors where the drums are. I could tell where the basses are, where the vocals are. It's super, super easy. And that's something that, again, I can't stress enough that you organize this stuff in a way that makes sense to you. And when you come up with a system, just stick with it. You know, I honestly just years ago I just randomly kind of picked, okay, yellow for drums. And just for years now, I've been doing all my drums in yellow and the rest of the color stuff that I just explained. So just pick a system and roll with it. Now, the other thing you'll notice here is like I have my drums labeled kick, snare drum. I have the synthesizer is the FL instrument, the 3-time oscillator, my vocals, and my bass. So I'm going to pull up Ableton now, and I'll give you a little example of how in Ableton, and I'll take it a step further also with the Ableton layout. So organization, naming the tracks, color coding, label everything. Again, take the time to do that, and you'll be very, very glad that you did. All right, there we go. Ableton's popping open finally. Let me close FL for now. And we're going to get deeper into all of this stuff. So don't worry if I'm not going as deep as you would like just today, because like I said, I wanted to lay all this stuff out first, and then we'll get deeper in for the next class. So for example, if this was let's say this is a kick drum, and then I'm gonna add another one. Let's say this is my snare, and I will abbreviate often snare. I'll just do SNR for snare. And then let's say this is percussion. And then let's add another one and say it is a clap, right? So I wanted to kind of expand on this now and show you that I'm not just doing the labeling and coloring stuff. There's another step as well. So I'm going to go ahead and label these and color them yellow, right? Just like I said. Now, another thing you can do is you can add another track, and you can do this in FL as well. And then I'll call this track drums in all capitals, or sometimes I'll call it drum sub for drum subgroup. Now, if you've never gotten into using subgroups before, that's definitely something that you want to start learning, because what's going to happen is, again, I taught you in the past couple weeks this micro and macro idea where you want to try and always break things down into the smallest parts possible. So what happens is you start getting a big track going, and let's say you got like 50 tracks. It's always going to be super easy to go and just tweak the snare just a little bit, tweak the kick drum just a little bit, and you go back to all these individual tracks. But one of the main things I want to teach you when it comes to mixing is 90% balance. And a lot of people, I think, don't take enough time getting their balances right, and they're trying to add reverbs and EQs and compression and all this stuff, when really you just didn't work enough on the balance between the instruments. Now the trick comes in when you're working on a song that, like I said, may have like 50, 60 tracks, and you're trying to balance this, but then because you change this over here, now this over here sounds a little different, and then you change this over here, and then you go back change. So it's this constant back and forth thing. So what I like to do is called subgrouping, where I will take all of these drums, and then I'll color my subgroup as well, yellow. And then I'm going to take all these drums, and instead of running them all to the main mix, you see where this says master right here? They're all going to the master output, just like in FL Studio. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to send them all to the drum subgroup here. So that means my kick, snare, percussion, and clap are all going into this drum subgroup. So what happens is once you get your levels here between the kick, the snare, your percussion, your clap, and whatever other drums you have, once you get your good balance of all the drums amongst themselves, now I'm going to put those all on this one fader right here. And let me pull up my my mixer here. So you can see how I could have my clap on the fader, percussion. So once I get all these guys balanced out, instead of now when I get to the big, so this is kind of the micro idea. When I get to the macro, the big part where I'm mixing the whole song, if I just go and listen in the car and I'm like, man, the drums really ain't hitting that much. Well, guess what? All I got to do is just take this little drum sub fader, and all of my drums are on that one fader right there. And then also, if I want to say add compression to all of the drums as a whole, or maybe let's say I'm mixing and it sounds like the vocals are super, super bright, but the drums are not quite as bright, and they're kind of like sounding a little dull next to the vocal. Or maybe I have, again, this is not just for drums. You can do this with all of your vocals. So I'll do that for everything. I'll make a drum subgroup, and then let's say I have right here, let's say I have my lead vocal, and then I have my background vocal 1, and then I have my background vocal 2. And like I said, I'll usually do these in like a bright pink. So now what I'm going to do is I create that vocal subgroup, color that pink also, and then again, like I said, I'm going to take all these vocals, and instead of going to the master, I'm going to send them to the vocal subgroup. So what I can do again here is once I get my balance here between all of these, and of course the lead vocal would be the loudest, and let's say I got the background vocals, and then let's say I would pan the background 1 to the left, background 2 to the right. Well, now I'm sending all of these vocals, and the pans and everything will translate over to this one fader right here. So what happens is, while you're mixing and you go listen to it in the car and you're like, man, the track is slamming, but the vocals are just getting lost. Well, guess what? Instead of going and just tweaking that one lead vocal, and then you go listen in the car and you're like, man, the lead vocal's cool, but now I can't hear the background vocals. Well, instead of doing just these single tracks at a time, you go and work on these subgroups. So if you think about it, let's say you had a song with like 50 tracks, but let's say 10 of your drum tracks go to one subgroup, 10 of your vocal tracks go to one subgroup, and so forth. Your basses go to a sub, your synths go to a subgroup, all that stuff. You may, at the end of the project, when you're actually trying to get the final mix going, you may only have like 5 or 6 different faders that you actually have to really work on. In other words, you get the balance of the drums amongst themselves good, and then you just work with this drum fader right here. You get the balance of the vocals good, and then you just work with this fader right here for your vocal sub, and you can do that for all of your instruments. So whenever I'm doing a mix, I'm always, again, to recap quickly, I'm organizing all the tracks, and that means I'm putting like tracks together. So all my drums are going to be on tracks in the same part of the project. My vocals will be in the same stuff together. My basses will be separated together, and my synthesizers will be separated together. Same thing with like effects, like whooshes and special effects and all that stuff. I'll even group my reverbs and my delays, all that kind of stuff I'll group. Because again, it's all about speed. The faster you can work, the more you're going to get out of your ears before you get tired. And as a bonus, the happier your clients are going to be, or your artist is going to be, because nobody likes to sit in the studio while you're just like, tweaking endlessly on knobs. So like I said, come up with a system that you can stick with, start using it today, and you're gonna start working a lot faster. So let's go to the next thing, which is, again, after you get your organization going, it's all about the balance, or the balances. And again, I think most people, they wind up spending a lot of time tweaking compressors, EQs, throwing effects on, all this stuff. And the problem is, if your balances aren't right, it's kind of like when you work on a track and the chord progression and the melody is just not good. You can tweak it and you can put as much effects as you want on it. It's just not going to be a good song. If it's a lame melody and a lame chord progression, it's just not going to be a good song. So again, if you have your balances are all out of whack, you can do all the mastering that you want to do. You can throw all the effects that you want onto this track, but you need to get the balances right. And there's a couple tricks I'm going to show you guys when we get further and deeper into this, as far as balances and all that go. One quick one, for example, I'll tell you right now is I learned this in a studio a long time ago. And the guy who I worked under, he used to work at Sony in New York. So like a big time studio. I mean, one of the biggest studios in the US. And he was telling me whenever he mixes a song, he always tries to place. Now this was for like hip hop and R&B stuff, but I thought it was a good concept to kind of think about as far as the level of the vocals. He said, I always try to put the vocal right below, just a touch right below where the snare drum is. So that rule is not super hard and fast. I think you got to kind of just listen on a lot of different systems to get vocal levels correct. And it depends on what type of music you're working on. But that concept, I'd never thought of it that way before. I always just thought something's either loud or it's not. And when he told me, I try to think of the vocal right under the snare, that's when I started thinking, because we all kind of know, okay, you can pan something to the left, you can pan something to the right, you can put it right up the center, right? But this kind of three-dimensional mixing where it's not just left, center, and right, but you also have space up and down. And that really struck me as a good tip, meaning you can think of things as being, this one's a little above a certain thing and this one's a little below a certain thing. So I might, have my snare drum here, and then when I put the vocal in there, I want to try and keep it right about there. Now for pop music, you may have the snare and the vocal about even, you may have the vocal even a little bit higher. But it's more about the concept with balances where you can think of the instruments kind of either on top or below each other. And I thought that was a pretty cool analogy. So the other one that I wanted to show and talk about with you guys, so we've got organization, balance, and then once you get into that, and I'll put with balances, I'll also add into there the subgrouping thing. Because again, it's just going to be a lot easier for you to get balances and to keep them and not screw them up if you put everything into subgroups and you start kind of working that way. So the third and final main one that I wanted to talk about right now today was references, or reference tracks. And I could talk for a long time about these, but I don't want to go on forever. So we'll just keep it kind of short today, and we'll expand on these in the next lesson. So reference tracks. Reference tracks are super, super important. And I'm talking to everybody out there that's in a studio, or if you're in your home studio and you don't have, let's say, proper soundproof material around the room, meaning bass traps or diffusers, all that extra soundproofing stuff. If you don't have that and you're just kind of in your, say, your bedroom and you're working like that, reference tracks, I cannot stress enough, reference tracks are going to be a lifesaver for you. Because what happens is you'll get into your song, you're making the beat, hey, let's throw some vocals on, it sounds cool, it's cool, yes, we love this song, it's awesome. However, I promise you, once you get into mixing your song, if you don't pull up any reference tracks, you're going to be sorry. Because what happens is you don't realize the amount of power and how separated and how clean everything is when something makes it to the radio. I mean, by the point it's made it to the radio, it has been just like tweaked to the best level possible. And the chances are your track that you've been working on in your bedroom for the past day or so is not going to be there yet. And I think the biggest point I wanted to make about this is don't get discouraged when you pull up a reference track, because it's going to be, you know, the reference track is, first of all, it's going to be professionally done all the way through. It's going to be professionally mixed, and it's going to be professionally mastered. So when I say a reference track, what I mean is pull in like 3 or 4 of your favorite songs that are somewhat in the genre of the song you're working on. So if you're doing an EDM like dubstep song, pull in a few dubstep songs, and I'm saying pull them actually into your project. Now you have to be careful when you do this, because let's say you're working on your song and you're mixing, and let's say you have like a compressor and a limiter on your master bus, your master output. Well, if you throw a reference track in there, if you're not careful, the reference track can also be routed, and normally by default will be routed into your master output. So you're going to be putting all of your compression, all your limiting, all of your mastering or mixing plugins are going to start going on the reference track as well, and you don't want to do that. So you need to make sure that your reference track is just going straight out to your speakers. And there's a few different ways to do that. I'm going to touch on that in the next class when we get further into these. But reference tracks are super important, because as cool as you think your track is, I promise you, when you pull in a good reference track that's either been on the radio, or it's like a dance hit, or it's something that's been professionally done, you're going to be surprised at how much power these reference tracks have compared to your track that you've been working on. So it's super important, and I would say before you even really necessarily decide, okay, I'm done with the track, let's start mixing, I would say pull in some reference tracks even while you're making your beat or your track. Because another thing that we're going to get into, and this will be the last one that I'm going to put in here for today, is, and this is for not necessarily, this actually does apply for pretty much any song you're working on, whether it's rock, pop, country, it doesn't matter. But I'm going to put it in here because it's pretty much applies for everything nowadays, and that is samples. And when I say samples, you know, if you're a rock person or a country person, you might be saying, samples, what do I need samples for? Well, especially when it comes to drums these days, I would say about 95% of stuff that you hear, maybe even more, is being beefed up and augmented with the use of samples. So what that means is you're not just hearing the drummer out in the room on the drum set playing. You're hearing what he played, and then most of the time producers and mixers are putting extra samples under the drums to give them that extra smack. Because what you're going to learn over the course of your career is if you're trying to just always compress the crap out of a drum or EQ it way up, well, especially with drums, let's say you're trying to super compress the snare drum so you can get it to really crack, and then you're adding a bunch of high-end EQ because you want it to be nice and bright and crack like what you hear on the radio. Well, what you don't think about until you start doing that is the snare drum mic is right over here by the hi-hat. So once you start compressing and EQing, you're inevitably going to get some of that hi-hat bleed in the microphone as well. So what a lot of guys figured out over the years is, man, it's just easier just to put a sample of just a really loud crack and snare drum in there, and that way you can beef your drums up. So that's for like rock and country type stuff. If you're producing, say, like rap, hip hop, EDM, stuff like that, the reason I'm saying pull these reference tracks in first before you even necessarily start mixing is because when you listen to them, you may listen and be like, man, my kit, especially for like a house music or EDM type of thing, your drum, specifically your kick drum, or even in like hip hop, the 808s that you may be using, they may not even, the samples themselves may not really be up to par as far as what you need to really make them smack the way that the stuff here, you hear on the radio smacks. So you may actually, after you pull your reference tracks in, you may need to go back before you even start mixing and listen to your samples and really think and say, okay, do I think this sample, before I do anything to it, can compete with what's on the radio? Because there's nothing worse than sitting there EQing, compressing, putting distortion, all these different plugins on your kick drum, and at the end of the day, the easiest thing to do was just find a better kick drum sample. And that's something that I fought with for probably a few years before I finally relented, and I was like, you know what? I'm not going to fight with these plugins and all this stuff anymore. I'm just going to go get a better sample and put it in the track. So that's another thing I wanted to just discuss quickly is, if you get to the end of even the end of a mix, let's say, I've had songs that I mixed and they were even mastered. I brought them out to the club that I was DJing at, and even after all that work, you may play it on the dance floor, or you may play it in your car or wherever it is, and you may listen and it's just not hitting right. And unfortunately, a lot of the time, it means you just need to pick a better sample. And that's something that's hard to swallow when you've been working on stuff. And like I said, you've been mixing maybe 6 or 7. I mean, I've done songs where I did 10 different mixes. And at the end of the day, I just had to suck it up and say, you know what? I just need to replace this kick drum sample with something better, because this drum, and that's on a song by song basis. Some drums are going to work better for other songs. Some drums are going to work better on a different type of song. So don't be afraid. That's really the main thing I wanted to convey to you today. Don't be so locked into all the work that you put in to say, oh, I don't want to change the drum because I already put all these plugins on this drum and I edited it and I did all this stuff and whatever. You can switch out drums as far as samples go pretty easily. And I'm going to show you guys some tricks, because you might be thinking, oh man, I don't want to go in and, let's say you printed your kick drum that originally, let's say it was from a plugin, or a sampler, and you had done the MIDI like we did some of the drum programming in a previous class, and you may be like, oh, I don't want to have to go in and like program in each drum again so I can use a sample. So that's something to keep in mind when you're programming drums. I always recommend, when you start out producing, or even throughout the whole song, always be doing a save as, and just keep incrementing the version, version 1.1, version 2.1, version 3, and I kind of went over that in a previous class. I'll touch on it again. But in other words, if you keep saving as when you go through your project, by the end, let's say you do get to a point where you're like, man, this kick drum is just not working that well. Well, if you save that original MIDI track where you did the original programming, all you have to do is pull up another sampler and you can just start throwing in kick drum, new kick drum, new kick drum, new kick drum, or a snare, or whatever it may be. Even for your synth parts, sometimes there may be a synthesizer where you're trying to do all these plugins and everything, and the sound itself just might not be right for the track. So what you need to do is save as all along the way. That way you can get back to that original MIDI part, and then you just start switching out sounds. And the cool thing about that is when you get to the end of the track, you have a better context of, okay, this is kind of, because we all know you start a track out one way, and by the end of the song, it kind of sometimes will turn into a whole nother thing. Sometimes it'll turn into a whole different genre of music. So if you can go to the end and you're now hearing all the instruments, all the vocals, everything, the effects, all of it, and you can hear the song like that, that might be the best time then to say, okay, if this is a club song and I really need the drums to hit, let me listen to the song as a whole now, and now I'll start switching out some drum samples at the end, and that way you can hear if they work well in the song. Like I said, if you get the opportunity to play the song out in a club, or if you go listen in your car, in your friend's car, listening on headphones. Another big one is the phone. If you're listening on the phone, you need to hear all those instruments, and sometimes you just might not have the right samples to really cut through the way you need to. Sometimes you may have the right, let's say for a kick drum, you may have the right kick drum for the low end, but you're not getting the punch in the mid frequencies, or you're not getting the click on the top end, the high end. So what you may have to do then, you might not have to switch out a sample. You may have to add a little drum sample on top of your kick drum. Or let's say you're not getting the pop out of your snare. You may have to actually, at the end of the song, you got your singer belting out, their vocal line, or the rapper is going crazy on the mic, and your snare might just not stand up to that. So you need to, let's say, layer a new snare on top of your original one to get it to really cut through the track. And I just find that stuff's often, when it comes to mixing, especially with samples, it's just a lot easier to get the right samples as opposed to spending all this time, I mean, sometimes days, trying to mix and tweak a sample that's just not the right one. So anyway, I know today's lesson was not super sexy because we're just kind of doing a whiteboard presentation. But in the next class on Thursday, I'm going to start going through these a little bit deeper. I'm going to start showing you some examples. I'm going to start showing you some tricks to get your tracks louder. And that's even before you get to mastering or really for proper mixing. Because I know a lot of people want to get their stuff louder these days. So I'm going to go into all that stuff in greater detail in the next class. But I wanted to just kind of lay out these few things for you so that, again, the most important thing I think right now you could do if you don't have a system for naming your tracks and color coding your tracks, come up with that now, because once we get into these later lessons and we start getting tracks, tracks after tracks after tracks in these songs, it's going to be a lot harder to keep up if you don't name and especially color code your stuff. You should be able to just look at your project when you open it and say, boom, there's the drums, boom, there's the vocals, boom, there's the effects, there's the basses, there's the synths. You shouldn't even have to read the names of the tracks. So come up with that, work on getting yourself a system if you don't have one, and then if you have a song that you've been working on, go ahead and pull it open and try and make a little deal with yourself. Say, I'm not going to use any plugins at all. No EQ, no compression, no nothing. I'm only going to work on balances and putting all of my tracks into subgroups and then working on the balances between the subgroups, and print a couple audio versions. And just FYI, when I say print, that's just the way I say basically bounce an audio file out of your mix and go listen to it in the car. Go listen to it on your headphones, listen to it on the phone, listen to it on your stereo at your house, all that stuff. And only work on the balances. And then once you do that, pull in a reference track and see what your song sounds like when you play a reference track right after it. And then what I like to do is play a reference track for a few seconds before, and then I'll play a few seconds of my song, and then a reference track right after. So you can kind of sandwich it between, and you can hear your stuff compared to these professionally done songs. And if you want to compete and get your stuff on the radio, get your stuff on the dance floor, you have to stand up to these reference tracks. So definitely go find some stuff that's similar to what you're working on, and start comparing your stuff early on and see where your stuff is lacking. So, all right, you guys, that's going to be it for today. Once again, if you're just joining us or you're just catching us on the back end, be sure to go to the comments on Facebook. I put the Music Producer School community link in there. Go ahead and join that on Saturdays after class. I'm going just over to the community. It's a private community. And I'm going to have you guys and girls submit your tracks to me. And I'm actually going to be live just like this, listening to your tracks. And I'm going to give you feedback on the things you could do to maybe make them better. Or if it's just a kick-ass track, I'll just be like, hey, good job. That's an awesome track. So I did a couple of them this past Saturday. and the users that were on with me seemed to really enjoy it, and we had a good time. I think we all learned something from it, so it was a good time. So make sure that y'all go join the Music Producer School community, and once again, do me a favor and hit the share button on this stream so we can reach more people. And be sure also to leave me a comment if you're here and watching, or even on the back end and you're just watching later. Leave me a comment, and if you guys have any questions, once again, you can always send me a message on Facebook at Music Producer School, and I will see you guys next time on Thursday. Also, I'm going to be adding some new stuff to the Music Producer School store very soon, so I'll make an announcement about that as well. Thank you guys. I will see y'all for the next class on Thursday. Peace.